Some games feel revolutionary the moment you touch them. Others don't feel revolutionary at all. They just feel right. You pick up the controller, there are 6 attack buttons, light, medium, heavy. You move the joystick in a half circle, press punch, and a fireball comes out. 2 rounds, best 2 out of 3. Character select screen, timer counting down. It all feels so obvious now. But none of that was obvious in 1991. Arcades were built around short bursts of spectacle. Developers were trying to balance profit with fairness, and one company was wrestling with a simple question. How do you make a game that players want to keep playing, not because the machine forces them to, but because they choose to? On March 7th, 1991, Capcom released Street Fighter II into Japanese arcades. It wasn't the first one-on-one fighting game, but it would become the one that set the rules. Today, we're looking at how this sequel solved a business problem, accidentally invented the modern combo, fueled a console war, and quietly built the foundation that an entire genre still stands on. So pick your fighter, take your stance, and join us as we revisit the sequel that standardized the genre on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 288th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby, video games, a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are revisiting Street Fighter II, the arcade sequel that stepped into Japanese game centers on March 7th, 1991, and quietly rewrote the rules of competitive gaming. Developed and published by Capcom, it built on the foundation of a modest 1987 fighter and transformed it into something arcades had never quite seen before. With 8 distinct fighters, a refined 6-button control scheme, and mechanics that would accidentally give birth to the modern combo, Street Fighter II didn't just become a hit. It became the blueprints for an entire genre. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, the only person I know who absolutely insists on picking Rue every single time and then claim he's just well-rounded. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, be honest, are you mastering spacing, or are you just spamming Hadoukens and hoping that I jump in time?
Well, it depends, Dave. Sometimes I can spam the Hadoukens and get you in a nice little juggle. And
Oh,
other
you
times
got
I
in.
just play Rue because I like cheese and making a Rue is fun.
Oh my God. I don't know
Also,
whether to be offended or proud because that is 100% a Southern thing. Yeah.
I mean, you make a Rue when you're doing mac and cheese, brother. But also, we have our favorite president, Haru.
Oh my God. Okay. Okay. Joining us again today also is returning guest Ryan Shepard, who I'm pretty sure would have had his quarter lined up for the cabinet waiting for the next chance at us. Ryan, be honest, were you usually the guy defending the machine or the guy waiting to knock someone off?
Look, I'm trying to think of a witty comeback, but my mind is just blanka.
Damn.
Do you, are you you got the one from earlier in your toolkit? We gonna hear that one?
It might come out, might make
It
an
might come
appearance.
out. Okay, okay, all right. I'll give you some breathing room. Sure, sure, sure. Ryan, I'm gonna start with you. You spend any time with any of the Street Fighter Two versions?
Yes, a bit. Most of my experience was with Street Fighter Two is just counting, how many times it came out because it seemed like they I thought for a long time that Capcom just didn't know how to count to three. That turns out that's mostly a Valve thing.
Oh, wow. You are pulling out all the stops today. That was a good one and a true statement. Rob, what about you? Any familiarity with a Street Fighter 2? Any version of it?
I can't say specifically Street Fighter 2. Obviously, I played games in the series, but as far as which ones, I don't fucking know, Dave. I'm sure I have. I mean, you probably kicked my ass in it at one point and made me hate the game.
Yeah, we had it on the Super Nintendo for sure.
Then, yeah, you kicked my ass in it and made me hate Street Fighter, and that's why I got good at Mortal Kombat. And I say good, and I'm really
No,
not.
no, that's probably true. I probably beat you on this, and then you wiped the floor with me in Mortal Kombat, to be fair. So I wasn't very good at Mortal Kombat. But we had the Super Nintendo version of this, and I was obsessed with it for a while. So, all right. Well, this is quite a story, a lot to talk about. But before we get to that, as usual, Rob, why don't you share with our listeners what else has happened during the current week in gaming history?
All right, well, kicking it off. It was around this week in 1980 that Star Raiders was released for the Atari 8-bit computers, becoming one of the earliest examples of a fully realized space combat simulation on home hardware. Developed and published by Atari Inc., the game placed players in the cockpit of a starfighter defending the galaxy from invading forces. Unlike simpler arcade shooters of the time, Star Raiders featured a strategic galactic map, hyperspace travel, resource management, and first person cockpit combat, blending action with simulation elements in a way that felt expansive for its era. Its depth and technical ambition helped demonstrate the capabilities of Atari's home computers and influenced later space sims for decades. Often cited as a landmark title of early PC gaming, Star Raiders showed that complex, immersive experiences were possible outside of the arcade.
Very revolutionary game for its time. We did an episode on it. I can't recall what the episode is off the top of my head. Go check it out. It's somewhere in our archives. It's ahead of its time in a lot of ways, to be honest with you. But if you aren't familiar with Star Raiders, I would highly suggest going to check it out.
Yeah, and it started the space sims, and I dig those, so pretty
Yeah,
sick.
same.
Next up, we have on March 4th, 1999, Pepsi Man was released in Japan for the PlayStation, delivering one of the more unusual licensed games of the era. Developed by Kid, the game starred Pepsi's Japanese mascot in a fast paced, forward running action experience where players dodged obstacles, leapt over hazards, and slid through city streets to deliver soda to thirsty civilians.
Heck yeah.
Hell yeah, man. I mean, who wouldn't want Pepsi Man to deliver you soda?
It's ridiculous.
Oh, it's fantastic. Structured across short, increasingly chaotic stages, Pepsi Man leaned forward into absurdity, complete with live action cutscenes featuring an American man obsessed with Pepsi. Why wouldn't we be? And while never released outside of Japan, the game gained a cult following over time for its bizarre premise, branding heavy presentation, and early example of the endless runner style gameplay loop that would later become common in mobile gaming.
I mean, Pepsi Man, man.
They should have had a crossover game with, Avoid the Noid.
100%.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
So we've talked about Pepsi Man before. We did an episode, I think it was in our second year, on Tapper, that was more of an episode on advertisement games, the whole genre of advertisement games, and we talked about both Yonoid and Pepsi Man, and I couldn't agree more. These are ridiculous games. Pepsi Man is so weird. It is so unbelievably weird. If you have no familiarity with it, please go watch a YouTube video.
Yeah, and adver games were definitely a lot of fun. I remember in that episode talking about the Captain Crunch game that I used to play as a kid.
And Chex Quest.
Oh, yeah. Forgot about that one.
Chex Quest, Chex Quest, and the Burger King trio.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For Xbox, all the releases they would do with the kids' meals, and I didn't talk about it then, but another one that recently popped up on my timeline was Lego Island.
Oh yeah, we have a somewhere in the future timeline. We have a whole episode on the Lego series games. So
Fuck yeah. But
Yes.
that's for another day. Keeping it with today.
Snake King, R.I.P. The
Yep.
best game.
Big Bumpin' wasn't the Big Bumpin' one of them too?
I don't know, Dave, but speaking of bumping, on March 5th, 2001, Conker's Bad Fur Day was released for the Nintendo 64, delivering one of the most unexpected tonal shifts in the console's library. Developed and published by Rare, the game followed the foul-mouthed Squirrel Conker on a drunken quest to return home, parodying film genres and pop culture along the way. Beneath its crude humor and shock value was a technically impressive platformer featuring cinematic presentation, varied gameplay styles, and a robust multiplayer mode. Released late in the Nintendo 64's lifespan, Conker's Bad Fur Day stood in stark contrast to the family friendly image often associated with the platform. And though initial sales were modest, the game has since become a cult classic, remembered for its bold satire and willingness to push boundaries during an era dominated by mascot platformers. And with that, I am the Great Mighty Pooh.
Uh, yes, that's your a boss battle. I know a boss battle against an opera singing pile of poo is iconic in so many it's ridiculous. Side note, this is the Nintendo 64 release, but they did re-release it updated for the Xbox One, which means it's playable into the current era of Xboxes if you're interested. Wasn't it called like Conker's Bad Fur Day Reloaded or something like that?
I
Live and
believe,
Reloaded.
Live and
Conquer Live and
Reloaded.
Reloaded.
Yep,
yes,
because they
sirs.
added the multiplayer. Yep, you got it.
Indeed. And sticking with the topic of Xbox, it was on March 2nd, 2004 that Ninja Gaiden was released, reimagining the classic side scrolling franchise as a fast paced 3D action title. Developed by Team Ninja and published by Tecmo, the game followed Ryu Hayabusa on a globe spanning quest for vengeance, blending precise combat mechanics and demanding difficulty. Known for its fluid animations, deep combo system, and punishing enemy AI, Ninja Gaiden quickly earned a reputation as one of the most challenging action games of its generation. Its release helped establish the Xbox as a platform capable of hosting hardcore, technically impressive action titles, and we explored the series' transition from 2D to 3D and its enduring design philosophy back in episode 27 of the podcast. So if you want to
Hmm.
learn more, go back and listen to the really old episodes before Dave and I really knew what we were doing.
Yeah, it was before we knew what we're doing. But since we do know what we're doing, if you do catch us on social media and you've been following the videos that I've been doing daily, I did one for Ninja Gaiden, and as part of that video, I put the 2D version and the 3D version next to one another at the same time. So it's kind of a cool comparison if you want to see how the old school and the 3D look side by side. So go check it out.
Yeah, go check it out. And if you don't know the socials, well, figure it out.
Just our podcast name on every social media.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Last up for this week in gaming history, on March 6th, 2013, SimCity was released for PC, marking a long awaited return for the city building franchise. Developed by Maxis and published by Electronic Arts, the reboot introduced a new glassbox engine designed to simulate individual citizens, traffic patterns, and regional economies with greater detail than ever before. However, the game's mandatory online requirement led to severe server issues at launch, preventing many players from accessing the game during its first days on sale. While its simulation systems and visual style were praised, the rocky release overshadows its innovations and sparked widespread debate about always online DRM in single player games. In the years since, the 2013 SimCity has become a defining example of how technical infrastructure can shape a game's legacy just as much as its design.
FU 2013 SimCity for killing one of my favorite franchises.
Yeah, F you.
Sad. Very, very sad.
Yeah, that's why you instead went to that other city builder, City Skylines. Well, Dave, we might not be talking about games that were killed today, but who knows? Why
We're
don't you?
talking we're talking about a game that made a killing, though.
Well, you know
Heyo.
that's a good point, Dave. And why don't you go ahead and tell the people today about how this game came to be and what made it so damn good.
In 1984, a Japanese video game designer named Takashi Nishiyama helped design what's widely considered the first beat 'em up game, which was a game called Kung Fu Master. Now, Kung Fu Master was a side scrolling fighting game where you battled your way across 5 levels of the Devil's Temple, it was called, to rescue your girlfriend. But at the end of each stage, the scrolling stopped, and the game became a one on one fight against a boss. Those boss battles stuck with Nishiyama. Now, Kung Fu Master went on to influence many other games in the years after its release, one of which, not even joking, is Super Mario Brothers. I'm being totally serious about that. If you don't know the story, go back to our episode on Super Mario Brothers. That game influenced one of the most influential games of all time. But it also influenced Nishiyama, and he basically was left with the idea to create an entire game around the boss battles themselves. That idea would become the original Street Fighter, which was released as an arcade cabinet in 1987. Now, we've told its full story before, back in episode 102. That includes its pressure sensitive punch pads that left some players bruised before Capcom pivoted to the now standard 6-button layout. The first Street Fighter also introduced command based special moves, it introduced blocking, it formulated the one on one duel, but it wasn't very refined as a game. You could only play as Ryu or Ken if you were player 2, and they shared identical movesets. They were literally just palette swaps of the same character. The controls were stiff, the difficulty swung wildly. Still, it was something new, and Street Fighter as a cabinet was moderately successful. So much so that rival arcade developer SNK headhunted the team behind it and ended up hiring Nishiyama away from Capcom. Capcom understandably wanted a sequel to Street Fighter because, as we say every week, money, right? But by this point, Nishiyama had already left for SNK. And so another Capcom employee, Yoshiki Okamoto, had stepped into a larger role inside Capcom to fill his shoes as kind of the producer, the leader over the Capcom's arcade division type deal. The they don't the roles and the titles that everyone had back then, they don't really line up with what we think about as producer, director, so on and so forth. This is still early in the industry before those were all kind of defined. Now, Okamoto had a reputation, right? Multiple interviews over the years have described him as incredibly intense. He's loud. He is willing to argue. He is not always inclined to follow directions cleanly. Okamoto also had really strong instincts for what would make money. He traveled to the United States shortly after around this period, and he saw that our arcades were filled with side scrolling beat 'em ups, especially Double Dragon. And so he read the room. That was where the quarters were going. That's where people were spending their money and spending their time. So instead of building Street Fighter 2, immediately the team pivoted. Basically, he told Capcom, I mean, he didn't even tell Capcom, to be honest with you. He just didn't listen to them. They said, build a Street Fighter sequel, and he said, okay, and then did something else. And that something else was a side scrolling brawler. Capcom caught wind of what he was doing pretty early on, and they essentially said, fine, whatever, but you're calling it Street Fighter. So at trade shows, this game that they were making appeared as Street Fighter 89. The main characters in it were going to be Ryu and Ken from the original Street Fighter. There was a whole story built around them. But the truth of the matter is in the industry, Street Fighter still carried kind of a bad reputation. Those original cabinets, basically the original cabinets had these pressure sensitive buttons that people would either break or it would break them. People were literally coming away from these cabinets bruised and bloodied because they were punching the cabinet so hard. And so Street Fighter still had this reputation in the industry that that kind of lingered over it at this point. It hadn't dominated arcades. It was successful, but not mind-bogglingly so. It hadn't really defined anything. It was a good fighting game. Like, it standardized one-on-one combat, but it wasn't something that people were lining up to play. So the Street Fighter name didn't really hold any weight. And so Okamoto understood the branding just as well as he understands chaos, so to speak, and decided that the name was going to disappear. So that game became Final Fight instead. And Final Fight sold extremely well. Capcom was thrilled because they were making money hand over foot, so they asked for Final Fight 2. And this time, with the market strong and the company confident, Okamoto decided to push back again in the opposite direction. Not making Final Fight 2. How about we make Street Fighter 2 this time?
I mean, as one does.
That was just Okamoto being Okamoto.
Following your gut.
Hey, he had banger after banger after banger, Okamoto. We've covered him before. He has a stellar career. If the team was going to revisit Street Fighter, it needed to be done properly. And properly didn't just mean bigger, right? It meant smarter. It meant answering a question that had quietly followed arcade developers since the beginning of the industry. Because by the late 1980s here, arcades were kind of in a strange place. There were hits like Space Invaders that had proven something important a decade earlier, that short, intense sessions could generate enormous revenue. In Japan, a single play could cost 100 yen, which was roughly a dollar. If the player died quickly, the developer earns money, the operator earns money, but the player maybe not so happy with the small amount of time they just spent a dollar on. And so inside Capcom and their arcade division, that tension was at the forefront of a lot of discussions. If you made a shooter packed with bullets and explosions, players had fun, but if that experience ended too quickly, frustration really crept in. If you made the game too long or too easy, the arcade didn't earn enough. So the team began asking that bigger question: how do you make the developer happy, the operator happy, and the player happy all at the same time? At one point, they considered physically larger arcade cabinets, something that looked and sounded a premium, that they could justify charging 500 yen or $5 per play. Developers would make more per session, players would get a bigger spectacle, but operators would have to swap in massive new hardware that was also much more expensive. So that idea wasn't realistic. Then came the realization: what if two players competed against each other? The operator would collect 2 coins instead of one. The cost of the player would feel smaller. Now, it's not to say that two-player games didn't exist until this point, right? We know that there are other two-player games that existed up until this, but there was nothing really that like captured the public's imagination per se. There were little ones here and there, but there was no competitive culture at this point. There was just other than the single player high score part. There wasn't competition in the sense of competing against one another one on one, if that makes sense. You also would eliminate that frustration coming from the computer being unfair, right? The outcome is determined by skill and not AI, so to speak. Now, they had flirted with this idea in Final Fight, but Final Fight is a co op game. Co op still means that the game dictates the difficulty. In a one-on-one fight, the difficulty isn't imposed by the game itself. It is personal. And this was kind of a breakthrough for this team in how they approached this. Competition became the design philosophy that drove Street Fighter 2. While that philosophy solved the initial arcade problem, it doesn't really explain why Street Fighter 2 felt so alive. Inside Capcom itself, the game wasn't just built around competition, it was built through competition itself. Several teams at Capcom were already competing with one another for prestige. Inside the Street Fighter 2 team, this same thing was happening. Something else was happening. The programmers were competing against one another. The artists were competing against one another. Each person was assigned their own character. And once that happened, rivalries began to form. You know, my character is going to be better than yours. My character needs a fancier moveset than yours. My character needs a better theme song than yours. Akira Nishitani, who was now pulling all these ideas together as a director, later admitted in an interview that he said yes to almost everything. When a programmer brought him something wild, he approved it. When an artist pushed a design that maybe didn't quite fit, he let it live. He didn't want to be the person who told someone that their idea was too crazy, so instead of narrowing the vision, he would widen it every time. If someone brought him a spinning pile driver that looked impossible, he'd say, okay, let's make it work. A green electric beast man from Brazil? Sure, let's try it. A yoga master who can stretch his limbs across the screen? Why not? You know?
I mean, hey, it clearly worked out well.
Absolutely. Nishitani would later say that as company president, he could never ever be that irresponsible again. But back then, that chaos was fuel for development. It didn't just create wild character concepts, it created contrast. The first Street Fighter had two characters. Street Fighter 2 launched with 8. Now, they weren't palette swaps like the first game had, they weren't minor variations. In a lot of ways, they were opposites, right? You had a fast Chinese martial artist with lightning kicks and a slow, towering Russian grappler who needed to get close to win. You had a disciplined American soldier built around charge timing and a Brazilian beast who moved unpredictably. Each character had strengths and each had weaknesses. So now we have matchups, right? All these teams are kind of balancing each other out, building these matchups. And the competition was extending beyond player versus player. It was also style versus style. Once they sorted that out and the roster was locked in, the mechanics had to match that same ambition. The 6 button layout that replaced the bruising punch pads returned, this time refined from the beginning, because that was the plan all along. So you had light, medium, and heavy punches, light, medium, and heavy kicks, not just for damage scaling, but for precision. Street Fighter 2 from the get go was really giving players a choice in how they expressed an attack, right? A quick jab to interrupt, a heavy strike to punish. And because the teams were competing with one another, you had a beautiful art style. Everything was animated with this clear silhouette separation. So you could kind of read those decisions in real time. And that clarity really made competition fair. But there is one more design tweak that would take things even further. Probably one of the biggest contributions Street Fighter 2 made to the entire industry. In trying to make special moves easier to perform, less about luck, more about intention, the team loosened the input timing window by just a few frames. So in the original Street Fighter, for instance, performing a shuriken required near perfect timing. If you didn't hit the punch button at the exact moment the joystick hit forward, the move simply wouldn't come out. Now it made the move feel powerful, of course, but it felt really inconsistent because you needed perfect timing. And so when they approached this game, Nishitani questioned that. He said, what if special moves didn't have to be difficult to be impressive? So the team widened the timing for the input window slightly, literally just a few frames. It was not enough to remove skill, just enough to remove the frustration of needing perfection. And while that seemed minor, well, a few frames seems like not a very big change, it was a huge change because that small adjustment opened a door that no one realized was there. If an opponent was still reeling from a hit, caught in what programmers called a hit stun, you could act again before they recovered. A crouching kick could now flow into a fireball. A jumping attack could land and connect to another strike. Now, because the input had a little bit of lag to it, moves were linking together. And this wasn't because the team set out to invent this type of system. This was just a concept where precision and leniency collided in just the right way. In that collision, Street Fighter II accidentally invented the modern combo. You know, Rob, what I love about that story is that it wasn't some grandmaster plan. It was a tiny adjustment, hit stun meeting timing windows, and suddenly the entire genre changed.
Yeah, they weren't trying to invent combos, they were just refining the feel.
Exactly. And honestly, that's how creative work usually evolves. Small tweaks, careful adjustments, getting the timing just right. And that's why I use Zencaster for our show. It gives us precision without friction.
So no dropped inputs?
Nope. You just log in through your browser, hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video. There's no complicated setup, no technical barriers slowing you down.
But what if something glitches mid recording? In the arcade, one bad cabinet and the whole match is over.
Well, that's where Zencaster shines. It uses multi layered backups, so even if your connection drops, your recording stays safe and the highest quality. You don't lose your progress.
And editing? I don't have to lab at it for hours like I'm learning a new combo, right?
Not at all. Zencaster's post production tools automatically clean up background noise, trim filler words, and balance your audio. The polish happens without the grind.
But once it's finished, how do I get it out there?
That's the best part. Zencaster lets you distribute your podcasts directly to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other major platforms, all from one dashboard. Record, refine, release.
Sounds like a clean input buffer.
Sure does. Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. If you've got a story to tell, this makes it easy to get started.
No dropped frames.
That's right. Head over to Zencaster, use our code memory card lane, and get 30% off your first month.
Do you think that you can launch your own podcast with Zencaster? Sure, you can.
Oh my God.
Sure you can. How big did this thing get, Dave?
By this point, Rob, the project had grown far beyond a simple sequel. Development stretched roughly 2 years, with somewhere between 35 and 40 people involved. The budget was estimated at around $2.4 million. That's a very significant investment for an arcade title in 1991. This wasn't a quick follow up, it was a calculated bet. And once Street Fighter II was ready, Capcom did what arcade companies always do, they location tested it, right? And at first, it did not look promising. Early tests in Japan showed the game averaging around 98, 99 plays per day. It's very specific, right? Not 100. The article said not 100. The team had projected 3 to 400. But worse, almost nobody was fighting each other. They were all playing solo. This entire concept had been built around head to head competition, and players weren't using it. Inside Capcom, people started second guessing that decision, right? You should have made another final fight. Okamoto had ignored that advice when he revived Street Fighter. And until the numbers improved, he genuinely felt the pressure. Capcom tried to communicate that battle play was the point, but it really didn't click until a Japanese arcade magazine called Gamest began writing about competitive matches as an exciting new trend. And once players saw it framed that way, something shifted. Suddenly, people weren't just interested in beating the computer, they were lining up to defend a win. And once that behavior caught on, the earnings would follow. Here in the United States, in California, early testing told a similar story, right? Midweek, one machine pulled in around $650. That's a solid take, but they were expecting $100 a week. So that kind of made them nervous. Then at the end of the week, they made over $1,300. For perspective, at the time, only like huge, massive multiplayer machines like 8-player Gallop Racing or air hockey or something else like that charging premium prices broke $1,000 per week, right? Street Fighter 2 broke $1,000 at standard pricing. Not they weren't charging premium for this one. So Goffland asked for another cabinet, and there was this fear from Capcom that two machines would split the audience. It didn't. They performed at the same level. And so that's kind of when Capcom got an inkling, right? They knew that this wasn't going to just be a modest success. They by all means it was going to be a massive one. But when a game becomes this popular, something else happens, right? Players start testing its limits. And Street Fighter 2 was being played constantly. Within weeks of release, players began discovering strange behaviors, interactions that the team hadn't really fully anticipated. Guile, in particular, became associated with several of them. Under specific inputs, he could freeze the machine. There was a glitch players nicknamed Handcuffs, where two characters would appear locked together for the remainder of the round. Another exploit allowed throws from distances that clearly weren't intended. And in other board revisions, some other sequences could literally reset the entire cabinet. These weren't features, these were side effects of a fast moving development cycle of increasingly complex systems. This, in all honesty, was embarrassing. There are interviews from the programmers in the arcade division that were embarrassed, felt shame that this arcade cabinet was out there with these. These are serious glitches, right? And then there were subtle ones that I feel make Street Fighter unique that weren't intended. For instance, Ken and Ryu were designed to be nearly identical, but they weren't. There was a single leftover value in the code that created subtle differences in vulnerability. Basically, there was supposed to be a moment of vulnerability after they threw after I think it's Rue throws his special move, and that was going to their intention when they initially designed it was going to be a counter, right? You could throw this really powerful move, the Hadouken, whatever one it is. I'm sorry, I can't remember, but it's going to leave you open to vulnerability. That's what they were thinking. But in the end, they decided to nix that concept, but they forgot to take out the value of code. So essentially, what happened is that one of them is a weaker character than the other. It's subtle, but it exists, and people have found it and found out the reason why, right? Blanca has an unintended weak point during his rolling attacks for the same reason. You can roll, but you're going to be vulnerable in a subtle way. And again, that concept of the concept got taken out of the main gameplay, but the code didn't, and so it created these weird situations. None of it was catastrophic, but in arcades, in competitive environments, even small inconsistencies matter, right? Because there are no patches, there are no balance updates. These are shipped boards that are permanently installed in these machines. And so once thousands of these machines were in the wild, every flaw in them starts to become part of the game, part of the ecosystem. And so these arcade communities popped up that quietly agreed not to use certain exploits. Other communities embraced them. But either way, there was this new behavior that was forming around this game. Players weren't just learning matchups anymore, they were negotiating rules, right? If Guile's long range throw was discovered at your local arcade, you had choices. Would you ban it, allow it, or learn how to counter it? Those weren't decisions that were made by Capcom, those were made by the players. And I think that's a very important distinction because, in a lot of ways, up until this point, most arcade games dictated the experience, right? The machine set the difficulty, the machine set the rules. But Street Fighter 2 was different in a lot of ways. The difficulty came from the person across from you. And now the culture came from the person across from you, too. Local arcade scenes began developing their own expectations. Winner stays on, challenger pays, best 2 out of 3, no cheap tactics allowed, or maybe everything's allowed, This kind of stuff isn't written in a manual or on the marquee of the cabinet. This is evolving on the arcade floors themselves. And really, once that happened, Street Fighter 2 stopped being just a successful arcade cabinet and it became the fixture, the foundation of a competitive environment. As competitive play took hold in arcades, Street Fighter 2 stopped being this static product, right? It became something that players were constantly testing against one another. They were dissecting matchups, they were debating exploits. One of the most common frustrations that arose out of all these conversations had nothing to do with glitches or balance. It had to do with character selection. In the original release, two players could not choose the same fighter. That restriction hadn't seemed important during development. But as local rivalries formed and players began identifying strongly with specific characters, it really became an obstacle. If two skilled Chun-Li players faced off against each other, one of them had to compromise. In a game that had kind of started to define its own identity around personal expression and mastery, that compromise felt really out of place and unnecessary. Also, players were asking about the four boss characters, which are Balrog, Vega, Sagat. I never know how to say that. Anyone else got that one? I think of Bob Saget every time I see it.
Beat me
That's
to it, Dave.
literally exactly what I was going to say. Are we the same person?
We are one.
Who's the fourth one? Anyone know the fourth one? M. Bison.
Joey.
Yeah, exactly. So these four boss characters were present in the original game, but they were unplayable. And so this competitive culture that was developing in the arcades was really pushing this need for expanded access and refinement. There is a marketing guy named James Goddard. James Goddard had been closely observing location tests and arcade behavior. And after hearing this in the arcades, he began advocating internally for a revised version of the game that would address these concerns. Initially, this idea was met with skepticism in Japan. The assumption was that the mirror matches, Chun-Li versus Chun-Li, for instance, would not be especially appealing, and that allowing boss characters to be selected might disrupt the balance. But again, the evidence from the arcade suggested otherwise. Players were not only invested in the roster, they were forming identities around it. They were dressing up like their favorite character, collecting things about their favorite character. So the evidence from this environment, was suggesting that these players wanted the system to evolve along with them. And so Capcom relented. The result was Street Fighter II Champion Edition, which was released in March of 1992. It allowed mirror matches, it made the four boss characters playable, and introduced balance adjustments and some other minor refinements that reflected basically a year of competitive observation. Now, this is not quite the modern idea of a live service update, but it was something close to its time, right? It was literally a response to player behavior in the arcades themselves. Now, Champion Edition did not replace Street Fighter II, it amplified it. Arcades already had dedicated floor space for the original version, but now they were allowing Capcom to upgrade their boards. Players who thought they understood the game suddenly had new matchups to study, because if you had a favorite character, you never yet had to think about how to defeat your favorite character. Mirror matches literally changed the psychology of competition overnight, and then, of course, the once untouchable bosses became part of the daily rotation. The earnings reflected this newly found interest in the game. The Champion Edition itself would go on to become the most successful arcade iteration of the entire series. They sold hundreds of thousands of cabinets worldwide and extended the life of a game that in most other genres would probably have already been considered complete. But sustained success creates its own complications, because demand began to outpace supply. Operators wanted cabinets faster than Capcom could manufacture them, and into that void stepped something that Capcom could not control. Modified boards began appearing in arcades across the world. Unofficial versions of Street Fighter II built on cloned hardware. Some were simple counterfeits that were sold cheaper than Capcom's official boards. Others went even further. One of the most infamous of these was a Taiwanese ROM called the Rainbow Edition. The Rainbow Edition did not subtly tweak balance, it accelerated the game. Characters could throw multiple fireballs in midair, special moves chained in ways that were never intended. The speed increased dramatically. So matchups that had taken months to understand were now thrown into pure chaos. From a design standpoint, it was unbalanced. From a player standpoint, it was exhilarating. From an operator standpoint, it was earning a lot of money. And that was a problem, right? Capcom initially dismissed these counterfeit boards as novelty. They were something flashy but unsustainable. But then members of the team went out to play the Rainbow Edition, played it for an extended period of time, and in doing so, something became very clear. It wasn't the extra fireballs that were addictive, it was literally the speed. After spending hours on the Rainbow Edition board, returning to the Champion Edition made the game feel incredibly slow, deliberate, almost heavy. The competitive community had already begun to accelerate mentally through these combos and tighter play. The Rainbow Edition pushed that tempo physically. And in the middle, what was happening was, whether Capcom improved or not, players' expectations really had shifted, right? They wanted it faster. Things were speeding up. So at that point, the company faced a choice. It could ignore the pirates and defend its balance, or it could respond. It did respond with what would become Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, which released in December of 1992. After Hyper Fighting, after that edition, in 1993, Capcom released a new version of Super Street Fighter 2, is what it was called. On the surface, it looks like another revision, but under the hood, it ran on Capcom's newer hardware, which allowed for improved sound, new character portraits, and they added 4 additional fighters. And so that original roster of 8 was now a roster of 16. Then in 1994 came Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. That version introduced a selectable super combo meter, which was a stored high damage technique that rewarded sustained pressure. It also quietly added a hidden boss character in Akuma. The original Street Fighter 2 really defined the modern fighting game. Champion Edition defined iteration, Turbo defined tempo, and Super Turbo defined escalation, right? By the mid 1990s, arcades were kind of saturated then with fighting games trying to replicate this formula. but the benchmark was still Street Fighter 2 in one of these mini forms. Only after that arcade dominance was firmly established did another shift begin, because the next battlefield wasn't the arcade floor, it was the living room. By 94, Street Fighter 2, as we know, had gone through, Turbo was its fourth arcade iteration. Um, but something else was happening in homes, right? Whenever a game becomes as popular, when lines form around cabinets, when players start bringing notebooks to track matchups, rivalries stretch across cities, people want to access it on their own terms. They want to practice at home. They want to settle grudges without waiting in line. They want the popular arcade cabinet in their living room. That's not a revolutionary instinct. That's natural. That's the way the video game industry shifts, right? Back in 1992, Street Fighter 2 was brought to the Super Nintendo, and it didn't really feel like a downgrade from the arcade. The port was remarkably faithful for its time. The 6-button layout was recreated with the SNES has 4 controller buttons and 2 shoulders, so you had 6 buttons. The character animations were compressed carefully, the music retained its identity. For many players, it was the first time that they could grind the matchups and the move sets without feeding quarters into a machine. That Super Nintendo port would go on to sell more than 6 million copies worldwide, making it one of Capcom's best-selling games of all time. Retailers featured it prominently in advertisements. Console bundles leaned on its popularity. For a stretch in the early 90s, Street Fighter 2 wasn't just a game on the Super Nintendo, it was a reason to own one. With it, Nintendo gained momentum. But as we know, in the mid 90s, we had a console war going on, and Sega did not sit still. Sega had built its Genesis identity around speed, attitude, and arcade authenticity. And so the company aggressively pursued its own version, which resulted in Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition for the Genesis in 1993. Of course, there were technical hurdles. The Genesis controller only had 3 buttons at launch, while as we know, Street Fighter 2 relied on 6. And so Sega responded to this by specifically releasing a new 6-button controller to specifically accommodate fighting games. And it would have that 6-button controller moving forward pretty much. And with that, the marketing intensified. Nintendo had the most accurate early port. Sega positioned itself as an arcade faithful alternative. Both companies genuinely understood what Street Fighter represented, right? Competitive depth, the cultural heat, the replay value. Um, so just as Street Fighter 2 was solidifying its place in living rooms, another fighting game entered the ring.
Mortal Kombat!
Where Street Fighter leaned into bright colors, exaggerated silhouettes, and these international martial arts archetypes, Mortal Kombat embraced digitized actors, darker lighting, and graphic finishing moves, right? The contrast was absolutely immediate. One felt like a global tournament, and the other kind of felt like an R rated action film. The competition extended beyond arcades. On consoles, that rivalry really became sharper, right? The Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat famously toned down the blood and violence, while the Genesis version included a hidden code to unlock the full bloody experience. And so, with that, debates about censorship, as we know, we've done multiple episodes on it. They spilled into news coverage, congressional hearings, and eventually this all contributed to the creation of the ESRB. But the rivalry wasn't only philosophical, it was personal too, you should know. Jeff Walker, who led Capcom's US sales efforts at the time, had a friendly relationship with Rob Holmes, who was the president of Acclaim, which was Mortal Kombat's publisher. By industry standards, it was understood that you didn't directly name your competitor in advertising. Capcom did it anyways. In one television spot, a security guard walks into a toy store. A wall of video game boxes begins to morph. Suddenly, Green Blanca's arm bursts out of the shelf and grabs a copy of Mortal Kombat, crumples it, and throws it to the floor. Walker later getting a phone call from Holmes that basically said, "You're such an asshole." Jokingly, of course. Holmes responded in kind. Later on, Capcom would produce a limited run Street Fighter comic book. When Walker flipped through it later, he realized something unusual. The advertising space inside the comic had been purchased entirely by Mortal Kombat, which I think is the funniest thing ever.
That's a pretty good one.
That I love the petty energy that's bringing. That's great.
Holmes sent him a framed copy of the comic with a note that said, "Serves you right." Oh my god, it was competitive, it was aggressive, it was also playful, right? It was a reflection of an industry that at the time was really still small enough for rivals to call each other directly. Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat weren't just competing for sales, they were defining what fighting games could be in their own respects. And to be fair, I think that Street Fighter 2 didn't invent one-on-one fighting games, but it did standardize them. It refined that 6-button layout. It's very common still to this day. It normalized character matchups and frame based balance. It proved that revisions could extend a game's life instead of replacing it. And as I hope that I have conveyed through this episode, most importantly, it fostered a competitive culture that would define the genre and others, to be fair, for decades. 35 years later, modern fighting games still operate inside the structure it established. Not because they have to, but because it just works. Ryan, what's your favorite Street Fighter 2 memory player? You got anything like that?
Well, I do have a question for you guys. When you're going up against Balrog, who's the best player? You know, who would you want in your corner if you're going up against Balrog?
Balrog Balrog has that little fire breath thing, doesn't he? Who do you
Yeah,
want in your corner? I always, I don't know. I mean, I was one who did cheap button mashing. So like Chun
yeah.
Li and her lightning kick, or Honda and his little slappy slap were kind of my go-to moves.
I would probably want Gandalf in my corner.
Oh my god.
I was thinking that same thing when you said Balrog, and I'm like, I want the wizard, man. Gandalf the Gray, Grant Gandalf the White. But like, I don't know. Dave just missed it. Missed the mark.
I missed it. I walked into that one. That was a good one, Ryan. I did not see that coming. It's interesting to see how much of what Street Fighter did is still there. Like I said, that structure that it established still exists to this day. If you want to see how that structure evolved over time, we've explored a few branches here on the show. Back in episode 102, we told the full story of the original Street Fighter with its pressure sensitive punch pads, bruised hands, and the first attempt at command based special moves that set all of this into motion. In episode 35, we looked at Super Smash Bros., which took the idea of competitive fighting and reimagined it through a completely different lens with, platform mechanics and percentage based damage and really a party game exterior that's hiding in a very deep competitive core. And in episode 227, we covered Battle Arena Toshinden, one of the early attempts to bring the fighting genre into 3D. A reminder that once Street Fighter 2 standardized the genre, the next step is always figuring out how to evolve it. You can, of course, find those episodes and more on our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
You can find a calendar of our future episode topics, know what we'll be talking about in our upcoming weeks. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave, I, and some other friends that we have in the chat. Maybe find out what we do on behind the scenes. And if you want to find out what we do behind the scenes, then you can find our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to the ad-free and unedited versions of all of our episodes. And you can find links to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is wrong. And as we know in his 15th appearance, Ryan is a Luddite who hates social media.
What's a computer?
Exactly. I'm so glad that you could phone it in today to join us.
Dialing it up.
Oh my goodness. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, a console. We've covered a few places before. We'll tell you each story. We hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down each week to research new topics, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's a fantastic cycle of teaching and learning, learning and teaching. And in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. So, as our guest today, Ryan, I will start with you. What did you learn today?
A number of things. Number one, uh, the idea of it being a two-player game, to prioritize getting twice as many quarters. Uh, it's brutal. It's efficient. Wouldn't have thought that that would have been where it all started, but here we are. And also, I know this game has come out. It's been ported to a number of platforms over the years. I didn't realize how many.
A lot.
It's like the Skyrim of fighting games.
Did you look it up?
It's on like 20 plus, depending on how you count different PC ports and stuff. Yeah.
To be fair, they modernized it. I didn't really talk about that, but they have modernized it. It's got like the Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD remix or something like that now, doesn't it?
It's a mouthful.
What did you learn today, Rob?
Well, at first, my favorite thing was that there was the little bit of code that made one of the characters not so good, and it was just kind of a look into like how a lot of fighting games are, where some are really still S tier and some are really crappy. But I think honestly, the thing that dwarfed that was the pettiness between Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat, with the magazine having a literal entire ad space bought out for the competitor. That's just, that level of pettiness is fantastic.
I
It's
know.
lighthearted, and I just think that's great when you see it. And it just shows that while that they both knew they could be successful games, they both decided, hey, let's have some fun with it.
I don't normally cover marketing or ad campaigns unless I really need the time. And as you know, we're running a little long. We did not need the extra time today. But every time I found something new out about this, it was just so interesting. I didn't want to let it go, because even the evolution of the games, how the audience evolved Champion Edition and the counterfeits evolved the Hyper Edition. That's just so freaking cool. The way that like you got to think about it, and this is going to be what I guess I'm just going to segue into what I learned. Right nowadays, it's so easy to update a game. You literally click a button and you shoot your updated code into the interwebs, and everyone gets an updated version. But that wasn't the case back when, and especially not here in arcade cab. Not anything, not arcade cabinets, not the consoles at all. Once you made a game, it's chips where it's chips. And so like you literally have to think of each of these versions of Street Fighter as patches, right? Their version 0.5 or 1, and then 1.2, 1.4. That's the way we would think about it nowadays. It is literally just the same game with version iterations. But back then that concept didn't exist, and so they literally had to come out with new versions of the game with different titles to help people understand that they were different. And that's just such a fascinating concept to me, to take what is such a normal thing to us and have to put it in that context of what it was at the time. I think that story is so great. And also I'm with you. The pettiness was a lot of fun. That's why I kept it in there.
No, I think both are great points, and just a lot to take in with this.
For sure. Before we take it out of here, special guest Ryan, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
Yeah. No worries. Akuma Matata.
Have you seen that video going around that tells you in English what the beginning of the Lion King song, the main theme song, says translated?
Coincidentally, I did, yes. And it made me laugh and feel so dumb.
It has been on my For You page and every social media, and every time I come across it, it makes me giggle. So much so that at work today, when I was laughing at my desk to myself, someone goes, "The Lion King video again."
All right, that's bad.
But it's so funny. Rob, have you seen it yet?
Yes, and I actually took some time to read through the comments and see that it can mean that in a literal way, but that's not the actual translation of what it was meant in that song.
Eh,
But like, it's still funny as fuck.
it's funny
It's canon.
funny.
It's canon.
All right.
Oh my
It's
god!
a lion.
It's a lion. Oh my god!
Look, it's a lion. Oh my god. That is the funniest thing ever. Rob, anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
As always, I'll take a moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us that you join us week in, week out, or that you're joining us for the first time, or, the first time in a long time. So thank you. And also a special thank you to Ryan for joining us. We love having you on the show, and we always look forward to when you can join us. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, indeed. When we started today's story, we talked about the boss battles, about how the scrolling would stop and two characters would face each other. The original Street Fighter tried to build a game around that moment. Street Fighter 2 figured out how to sustain it. It refined the controls, it clarified the animation, it loosened input timing just enough to make intention feel consistent. It built a roster that created contrast instead of copies, and then it let players test it all against one another. From there, everything else followed: the revisions, the tournaments, the rivalries, the console ports, the genre explosion. What's interesting about Street Fighter 2 now is that you don't always notice its influence because it's baked in. It's in the controller layouts, it's in the character select screens, it's in the way rounds are structured, it's in the expectation that balance matters. It's in the idea that a fighting game should reward mastery over randomness. The genre didn't just copy it, it absorbed it. And when something gets absorbed that completely, it stops feeling revolutionary. It just feels normal. But 35 years ago, it wasn't normal. It was a solution to a business problem, to a design problem, to a competitive problem. And in solving those problems so cleanly, Street Fighter 2 became something more than a sequel. It became a foundation, and foundations don't always call attention to themselves. They just hold everything up. Next week, we're trading arcade cabinets and quarter lines for drop pods and titans. Released in March of 2014, Titanfall wasn't just another first-person shooter. It was Respawn Entertainment's statement after leaving Infinity Ward, a promise that movement could feel fluid again, and that multiplayer could carry a narrative without a traditional campaign. It launched as an Xbox exclusive during a pivotal moment in the console wars, helped define the early identity of the Xbox One, and asked a bigger question about what next-gen shooters were supposed to feel like. So join us as we explore the ambition, the innovation, and the legacy of Titanfall on next week's Orbital Drop into Memory Card Lane. Do the thing.
Skibidi dap 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 doo.